He's now Willis S. and Marion Slusser Professor in the Department of Philosophy. The current academic year is thus John's 50th as an active member of the Berkeley faculty. This would be a remarkable milestone for any academic. But the sheer enormity of John's many contributions as a scholar, teacher, public intellectual, and forceful member of the larger Berkeley community make this turning point especially noteworthy. We've assembled here today to celebrate John's 5 decades of distinguished service to the Berkeley campus by looking back over some highlights of his career in our midst. I'm very pleased that 6 colleagues, friends, and former students of John's have agreed to be here on this occasion, some arriving from just across the campus, others from across the country, to share with us their reflections on John's many contributions and accomplishments over his 50 years on our faculty. Our speakers are Barry Stroud, the Willis S. and Marion Slusser Professor in the Department of Philosophy at Berkeley, Tom Nagel, who's University Professor of Philosophy and Law at New York University, Robert Cole, who's a Professor Emeritus in the Bolt Hall School of Law at Berkeley, Peter Hanks, Assistant Professor in the Department of Philosophy at the University of Minnesota and an alumnus of our PhD program at Berkeley, Maya Kronfeld, who received her BA degree in Philosophy and Comparative Literature last year from UC Berkeley, and who's currently working as a jazz musician, and Alex Pines, the Glenn T. Seaberg Professor of Chemistry at UC Berkeley and Senior Scientist in the Lawrence Berkeley National Laboratory. Professor Pines is teaching right now on another part of campus, and he'll be arriving a little later in the proceedings and occupying that chair to my right. Now I want to suggest that we proceed informally today. I'd ask our speakers to come to the podium in the order in which I've introduced them to make their remarks. At the end, we'll give John an opportunity to rebut any claims or accusations that he might take exception to, and also to offer some reflections of his own on his eventful half-century as a member of our faculty.
I'm very happy to be here. This man has been here.
You probably have to speak into the mic.
You could raise that, yeah.
He's been here 50 years, this man. That's half a century, right? And finally, they're having a day for him. Well, I've been his colleague probably longer than anyone has. And obviously, my role here is pretty clear. He's been lurking in the shadows for all these years. And I'm expected to tell all of you what this shy, withdrawn, self-effacing man is really like. Well, here he is, out in the light at last. Right. Now, really, no one needs to tell you what he's like. If you're here at all, as so many of you are, you already know him, or at least you have some idea of what he's like. And it's probably a pretty good idea. But it will be at best, of course, only partial. Whatever you think of him, it only captures part of him. And it's the same with me, even though I've been around him and known him longer probably than anyone here. I think of John and Dagmar as friends of mine almost from my boyhood. It isn't quite true, but when I think of those early days in Berkeley, I can't believe how young we all once were together. Yeah, I suppose it's something that happens to most of you. We would all get together almost every week and moan and groan about how slow or resistant our senior colleagues were to doing any of the things that we could see were obviously needed to make this a much better philosophy department, as junior colleagues continue to do up until this very day. But we didn't just talk about it. we were eventually able to do something about it by convincing other people, by getting new people to come and see how good things could be here, by making some bold moves, but above all, by not giving up. And John was always at the center of that. He has always cared deeply about Berkeley and about being at Berkeley, and he's always been committed to making this a better and better place for philosophy. And it's worked. And John has never given up. 50 years is a pretty strong commitment. And of course, it hasn't just been a matter of strategies and politics and other kinds of administrative activity. There is, of course, above all, John's contribution to philosophy. And part of that contribution, which most of you here will know, of course, is his teaching. He's taught thousands of eager Berkeley students over the years. He's helped raise the level of their thinking, not just about philosophy, but about almost everything else. And, of course, there is that huge and still growing body of John's philosophical writings. And all of that, and its fame and its influence, stands there as a distinctively Berkeley product. It's a huge part of what has made this department and this whole university the intellectually important place it has become in the 50 years that he's been here. Now, everyone knows about that work, its importance, its interconnectedness, and its impressive range. It's perhaps less well known to many of you that starting in the 1960s, John's writings were among the first new philosophical works in English to be translated into French and German and other languages and eagerly read and discussed and fought over throughout Europe. If there is now a much smaller gap and more two-way traffic than there used to be between philosophy in English-speaking countries and philosophy in continental Europe, as there certainly is a smaller gap, John Searle's work was a major factor in that change. It took some time before there was much of anything of equally high quality going from this side of the English Channel and getting absorbed so deeply into the philosophical culture on the other side. Now, by now, of course, the influence of John's work is worldwide. But he was in the forefront of what has developed into the mutually profitable interaction of philosophers on both sides of the channel. Well, that's the John Searle most of you here probably know best. The world-famous philosopher, the brilliant lecturer whose classes you have to fight to get into. But even if you don't get into them, you can buy the whole set of his lectures and look at them and listen to them at home. But it's not as much fun. Well, let me try to say a few things about what I think John Searle is really like. Some things you might have noticed yourselves. There is, or used to be, a psychological syndrome or attitude or cast of mind that was called low tolerance of ambiguity, right? Now, I haven't heard much of it lately. I don't know if it's still called that. By now, it's probably been identified with some activity in the brain. And ambiguity isn't exactly the right word. It's more like low tolerance of indecisiveness or uncertainty or indeterminateness. Right? Well, whatever the condition is called, John's got it. Right? He can't stand not to have a view about something. And he's not well pleased with others who either cannot or will not make up their minds. Right? Now, this is obviously true in deliberative meetings, for instance. But it's also true in philosophy. I must say that I myself have sometimes felt that I have incurred this kind of feeling on John's part. Right? He can give the impression that he regards uncertainty or wavering or even wanting to think about it a little longer as a certain kind of weakness, right? Like a wimp who's hesitant to ski down the steepest mountain or drive fast cars around sharp curves. I think I've seen some signs in recent years of John's apparently acknowledging that perhaps some ill-understood complexities lie behind some of the things that we all know to be true, but I think the basic syndrome remains. Right. Well, another and more important characteristic of John's, perhaps related to that, maybe not, is what I think is best described as John's loyalty or commitment. It might sound strange, does sound strange, but for all his individuality, there is a way in which John could be said to be a team player. Not that he plays on only one team, and not that he sinks into selfless anonymity on any team or any side he finds himself on, but he certainly stands up for the side he's on, and without doubt or hesitation. John believes in certain things, and certain causes, and certain people, and he sticks by them and defends them. For him, that's all there is to it. That's the side he's on. Now, this is most obviously true in relation to his family. And I've mentioned that it's true of his relation to the philosophy department and to this university. I believe it's also true of John's relation to this country. And the same is true of his relation to many individual people he's continued to think highly of over the years and to defend and encourage. His attachment to them and his support is simply not in question for him. But what a person is really like is shown in what they do and what they've been doing. And many of you here will perhaps not know what John has been doing, at least long ago in the 50 years beyond the philosophical teaching and writing that we're all familiar with. Well, I can't tell you much, but I can tell you that it has been a very busy time. When John first came here in the late 1950s, there was no Department of Homeland Security to keep us safe in our homeland. But there was a committee of the House of Representatives called the House Un-American Activities Committee. It was to keep us safe in our homeland by holding hearings all over the country, especially in California, to weed out activities and thoughts and attitudes that are not appropriately American and so a danger to us all. Well, when the committee met in San Francisco in 1960, John was there with hundreds of others, protesting the presence and activities of the committee, and so being herded away by the police along with other suspiciously un-American subversives. When Berkeley students protested the de facto ban on political activity on the campus in 1964, John was there again, protesting on the side of the students and playing an active role in forming the faculty's position of support. You can see some of the pictures of all that, of course, in the Free Speech Cafe just over here. Now, the protest brought down the chancellor of this university, and the new chancellor, who was appointed, had known John at Michigan when John was a visiting professor there a year or two earlier. So on arriving in Berkeley, that new chancellor made a very shrewd move. He appointed John as his special assistant for student-university relations, and so put him in charge of the conditions for protests and demonstrations on the campus. He had to make John his own special assistant, because to try to give him any more official office would have needed the approval of the regents of the university, and the regents were on to John, right? Because of his activities in the free speech movement and probably in the House Un-American Activities Committee too. So now John was on another team, but equally committed and equally effective. He remained for years on the front lines in that position through much of the turmoil of the protests against the war in Vietnam. Now, the target of that protest was, of course, much wider, but the university, perhaps even the very idea of a university, was still under attack. It was unenviable work by which John was, in those years, completely absorbed, or almost completely absorbed. He, of course, continued to do philosophy. So from his experiences in that job, he wrote a book about student unrest called The Campus War, and then he went on to what usually is called the rubber chicken circuit for several years, giving speeches to interested professional institutes about what I must report he used to refer to privately eventually as the kid problem. In roughly those same years, he was on television every week on a show called World Press. Half a dozen experts would review the press of the previous week from this or that region of the world, John covered the British press for some time, but he was so good at it, so brisk and incisive, that they made him the moderator of the whole show. Now, he could then try to keep everyone else up to the high standards he had set, mostly by asking them sharp questions that they hadn't exactly answered in their own prepared reports. It was a very informative show, but as we all know, John did not pursue a career in television. During his apparently all-consuming job in university administration, he was, of course, still teaching and writing the philosophy he's famous for. After he left the administration, he did many other things, including giving the famous Reith lectures on the BBC in London and broadcast all around the world. In this country, he was appointed to the National Council of the Humanities, and he made periodic visits to the Capitol as what some of us naively thought of as our man in Washington. He was also for many years on the board of directors of one of California's best wineries. He continued to give hundreds, by now probably thousands, of lectures to all kinds of audiences on all kinds of subjects. And all of this, in addition to the prodigious activity we see and hear him carrying out closer to home in that humming philosophical factory on the bottom floor of Moses Hall. Well, all this and more, much more, is what he's been doing for the last 50 years. It takes my breath away even to recount it. To carry on like that for 10 years would be formidable. To do it for 50 years, and to be still doing it now the way he was doing it then, is unbelievable. Does this tell us what John Searle is really like? Well, there's no capturing it. I've touched on only a few aspects, and others, of course, will tell more. But for me, I think John is summed up best in a single sentence, a sentence he wrote himself. It's my favorite sentence in the whole Searle corpus. It comes in his book Intentionality, when he's been discussing realism. He declares himself a realist. But he says realism is not a hypothesis or a belief or a philosophical thesis. And here's the sentence. I love it. Right? My commitment to realism is exhibited by the fact that I live the way I do. I drive my car, I drink my beer, write my articles, give my lectures, and ski my mountains. Period. Well, that's John. Well, not quite. That was Intentionality in 1983, so that was John then. Right? Now he drives a much fancier car. Right? He drinks mostly red wine rather than beer. He still writes his articles, but he writes almost as many books as he does articles. He still gives his lectures, which are even harder to get into, and he still skis his mountains. So that's John. But before we raise our imaginary glasses in a toast to John, we must remember that all this is only part of the story. Here's Dagmar. She has been there too, through all these 50 years and more. She's part of the team, part of the accomplishment. It's always been a team. It's true, perhaps, that Dagmar does not drive John's car, at least not the Porsche, right? She does not strictly drink John's red wine or his beer, right? But she does contribute to the writing of John's articles and John's books, as John has always made clear. And in that way, she also has a hand in John's giving his lectures. And, as part of the team, Dagmar, of course, still skis John's mountains. So, to both John and Dagmar, we say, congratulations and thank you for a wonderful 50 years.
What can it, do you have? Okay. I met John Searle the year before he came to Berkeley. When I arrived in Oxford as a Fulbright scholar in the fall of 1958, fresh off the boat, and it was a boat in those days, the Queen Elizabeth in my case, my first encounter with Oxford philosophy was a talk given at one of the university's discussion groups by Alison Knox, a graduate student in philosophy at the time. The talk was a response to John's article, Proper Names, recently published in Mind, and John was the commentator. I don't remember the content of the discussion, only that the room was packed, the atmosphere intense, and that it gave me the sense that I was at the center of the philosophical universe, which was probably true at the time. John was then a lecturer in philosophy at Christ Church, the vast, beautiful, and imposing college attached to the Cathedral of Oxford. He had arrived at the university in 1952 as a Rhodes Scholar, somehow without bothering to complete his undergraduate degree at Wisconsin. I've never known how he managed that. He stayed on as a graduate student after getting his BA at Oxford, and when I met him, he was completing the doctorate and was in his third year as a lecturer. I was never a student of John's, but Oxford was teeming with philosophical activity, and I got to know him through encounters at talks and seminars. He was, as he has always been, superbly accessible and outgoing, and he immediately treated me for no good reason as an equal. He even invited me to dine at high table in Christ Church, along with the canons of the cathedral and assorted dons in various stages of decay. John wore a three-piece suit, and for the only time in my life, I took snuff when it was passed around in the senior common room after dinner. John seemed perfectly at home in this venerable establishment, defiantly un-anglicized, with his pure Western twang and blunt style, unassimilated but unself-conscious. I have always thought of his failure to pick up the slightest trace of a British accent during his lengthy stay in Oxford as a phonetic expression of his strong individual character. He also seemed at home in Europe. His passport had had to be expanded with a large accordion-like insert to accommodate all the customs stamps from his frequent trips to France. He even had a French car, one of those gorgeous old low-slung Citroëns of pre-war design with big swooping fenders and a running board, a car I suspect most of you have never seen unless you are a fan of old Jean Gabin movies. Automobiles have always been profoundly important to John, and this gave him in advance a natural affinity for California. John and Dagmar were already an item at that time. She was still Dagmar Karbach and held a research position in politics at Nuffield College, having reached Oxford from Czechoslovakia circuitously by way of Australia. They were a vivid and irresistible cosmopolitan couple and were wonderfully hospitable and kind to me. Their capacity for friendship and generosity is an enduring quality of which I have been the beneficiary for more than 50 years. John was very attached to Oxford, which had formed him and which was then at its peak of philosophical strength and excitement. While I was there, I was able to study with J.L. Austin, Paul Grice, Peter Strawson, Elizabeth Anscombe, Philippa Foote, Isaiah Berlin, H.L.A. Hart, G.E.L. Owen, David Pears, James Thompson, Gilbert Ryle, and Bernard Williams. Austin was a commanding presence, dry, sarcastic, and devastating in public, but remarkably kind to students one-on-one, in my experience. Austin was visiting the Berkeley department, the Berkeley philosophy department, during the fall of 1958. So I encountered him only when he returned in January 1959. John told me that Austin had been seriously tempted by an offer to move to Berkeley. "You could build an empire there," John reported him as having said. But just at that point, Austin became ill and was diagnosed with cancer. He died in the spring of 1960 at the age of 48. In addition to being, along with Strawson, the most important early philosophical influence on John's work, I assume that Austin had a hand in his going to Berkeley. Austin must have seen the natural fit and recommended John to the university and the university to John. Initially, one might think it impossible to imagine two people less alike. Austin, the austere, schoolmasterly Englishman, and John, the hedonistic American extrovert. But I think there was a natural sympathy between them. They shared a sense of comedy, and both were combative and competitive, but at the same time highly social and committed to the advancement of the life of the mind through supportive institutions and collective effort. They both thought of philosophy as a team sport, with winners and losers, I might add. And they were both attracted to philosophical topics that emphasized the embeddedness of the individual in a structure of social interactions, rather than the relation of the solitary individual to the universe. The theory of speech acts, so important in the work of both Austin and Searle, is a prime example of this interest. John never took up the method of linguistic connoisseurship that was Austin's trademark. For example, the distinctions among shooting a donkey inadvertently, unintentionally, by accident, or by mistake. But John has always been drawn to empirical facts as a starting point for philosophical understanding, and the refusal to respect the boundary between the empirical and the a priori was also an important disposition of Austin's. Going through the Times law reports with Austin in his seminar on excuses was a delicious treat. Austin was my thesis advisor at Oxford, and I assume that he had an even more memorable effect on John, who knew him better, than he had on me. The importance of Oxford in John's formation cannot be exaggerated. He spent 7 years there and formed his philosophical style and some of his main interests during that period. After John and Dagmar went off to Berkeley in 1959, I stayed in Oxford to finish the B.Phil and then went to Harvard for the PhD. Barry Stroud and I overlapped as graduate students at Harvard in 1960 to 61, and then he too took a job at Berkeley. When I finished the degree in 1963, the job market was unbelievable. The post-war baby boom had reached college age, and state universities all over the country were expanding at warp speed. I went to Berkeley, partly because John and Barry, two good friends, were there, and I suppose they had something to do with my being hired. Berkeley was wonderful in all the ways you are familiar with. John and Dagmar were thriving and raising a family, and John was one of the most popular teachers in the university. When the student government course evaluations came out, I remember Tom Clark saying that John's evaluations read as though they had been written by his mother. This was the period when the Berkeley philosophy department moved decisively into the mainstream of analytic philosophy, and John's presence was crucial. For some time, Berkeley had had a stellar program in mathematical logic, but now the department began to reach out in other fields. This was part of a general tendency in the academic world away from institutional insularity and toward the creation of a dynamic international community. And then there were all those students. In his book about the troubles of the 60s, The Campus War, John cites sheer numbers as one of the causes of campus unrest and the breakdown of authority. He is there referring to the huge enrollments at individual campuses. But I think the really important number was the size of the entire age cohort of students at that time in this country and in other countries, which was quite out of proportion to the population of their elders. The baby boom generation, born in the years immediately after World War II, formed a society of its own, large enough and secure enough to set its own standards and not to feel that their lives depended on transforming themselves into grown-ups on the model of those who had left youth behind. The traditional source of adult authority, the desire of the young minority to be assimilated to the culture and norms of an adult world, was weakened by the sheer weight of numbers. That is why the baby boom generation has transformed American society so radically, as it has passed like a huge lump through the national digestive tract. Like John, I was here at the heady beginning of it all in 1964, when the free speech movement clashed with an administration that was under pressure from conservatives in state government and on the Board of Trustees. John, then still an assistant professor, was one of the first faculty members to side with the students. I remember him addressing a rally in Stroud Plaza and noting that the faculty group invited by the administration to help solve the problem was limited to tenured faculty. "I like that touch," said John. He eventually took an administrative post himself, and the conflict in Berkeley became more and more absorbing and destructive in succeeding years. By the time he published The Campus War in 1971, his mood was grim. I had decamped in 1966 to Princeton. Partly it was the pull of New York, which I had always loved, but partly it was the sense that the sources of conflict at Berkeley were deep and would make it a battleground indefinitely. I was spending too much time thinking about the latest disaster or the next. But John stayed, and with his combative nature, he seems to have managed to stay sane while embroiled in these battles on one side or the other. We were now friends at long distance, linked in the larger philosophical world through conferences and conventions, and even more recently by a common love for Paris, where we often find ourselves together in June, and where it is always a pleasure to take up again our extended pursuit of the higher gossip. The creative work of an intellectual discipline like philosophy is done in private, by solitary individuals or small groups interacting at a high level. John has been a major internal contributor to the field in this way, and I won't try to summarize his large theoretical achievements. But the place of the discipline in the wider world depends also on its having a public face, and the field of philosophy, and in particular analytic philosophy, is singularly fortunate that John Searle has been one of its most important representatives in the world at large in our time. This is due partly to his superb lucidity and force as a writer, comparable to that of Bertrand Russell in an earlier day. But it is due also to his powerful urge to engage with the significant intellectual forces, good and bad, in the civilization around him, to try to understand them, and to engage with them by making available as widely as possible what can be learned from the insights and methods of contemporary philosophy. There is a missionary element in John's makeup, as there was in Russell's. He is much more willing than most philosophers to expose himself to public conflict by attacking what he sees as the forces of darkness. While this is an expression of his essential nature, it is not without cost. Unlike some prominent polemicists, he goes into battle again and again without the benefit of a thick skin. Even though he has a fundamentally sanguine temperament, John takes things hard, harder than most people I know. And I am all the more grateful to him for so often leading the charge against sophistry and illusion. But John is much more than a dragon slayer. His extensive writings, both academic and popular, have given countless people throughout the world their primary understanding of the central questions in philosophy of language and philosophy of mind. He is one of the most famous and effective teachers of the subject of our time, and Berkeley is very lucky to be the place where for 50 years one has been able to encounter the man himself, an inimitable and unforgettable presence.
We have it on the highest authority that a prophet is not without honor, save in his own country and his own house. In the teeth of this irony, and in an ironic age, we are here in John Searle's house to honor him. For who could deny that John is a prophet? Nothing drives a prophet crazier than the people's ignorance of the obvious. And John's whole career has been to get us to see the obvious, which of course is plenty complex when you get into it, and to change our ways of thinking. His lifelong assault on error and his dedication to truth have always been supercharged with the moral commitment of the prophet. Knowing the truth is a moral necessity. And who's it necessary for? Illegally ending a sentence with an italicized preposition like that is a favorite Searleism, as you know. Who's it for? It's for us, the possessors of knowledge. The prophet's love of truth is a fundamental moral concern for persons. I imagine there is no honor so sweet as this in his own house. John's other honors are impossible to count, but we know him best and we owe him most. We know him and we owe him for his monumental philosophical work, which is mostly what John Searle is to others. But we know him and we owe him for much more too. For engaging charm, for personal edification, for loyal friendship, for teaching of stunning power, for unfailing insistence on the highest standards of intellectual integrity, and for enduring service to this university. Only we can acknowledge John for all this, and we do it now with all our might. It does take all your might to acknowledge what John has accomplished in just 50 years. Two things are striking about the list I just recited. One is how comprehensive it is. John has done everything, personal and professional. The other striking thing is that everything John has done, from social relations to writing books, is of world-class quality. It is, to use another of his favorite words, prodigious. The most profound of that service, which most of you did not see firsthand, was John's crucial part in the free speech movement, which Tom and Barry have mentioned, and his even more profound role in the administration of Chancellor Roger Hines that followed the FSM. The truth is, we might well not be here today without John's service as Assistant Chancellor. He helped save Berkeley as one of the world's great universities. We were, in fact, on the very brink of collapse as a serious university. It was during the FSM that I came to know John well. He had been here. He had been an early and important leader of the faculty group that supported the FSM students. I joined that small steering committee relatively late, and we drafted the famous December 8th resolution that ended the immediate crisis. When Roger Hines became chancellor 6 months later, he appointed Bud Chait, who's here today, as executive vice chancellor, and John as assistant chancellor. Perhaps it was, Barry said he was special assistant to the chancellor, whatever the title. Bud asked me to become faculty consultant, and I think it is fair to say that the four of us, with our varying roles and varying authorities, of course, essentially ran the political side of the campus and its relations to the regents, governor, and public. What the FSM sought was to bring the constitutional protections of speech and due process to the campus. The precise issues were in some way technical, but the outcome was about much more. Campus restrictions on partisan political activities and on speech activities of every which sort in the early 60s would be unimaginable to the contemporary student or faculty member. So profoundly did the success of the FSM, epitomized by that December 8th resolution, change American universities. Still more, the very conception of the university and of the student in it changed radically, forever, and for the better. What the Hines administration sought was to create and guide that change. It sought to institutionalize freedom of speech and other legitimate claims of students that came along with the FSM revolution, to build on its energy for educational and curriculum reform, and to do all this while adhering to the strictest principles of academic integrity and while fighting off the enormous pressures, internal and even more external, designed to politicize the university. Berkeley did succeed, against the odds perhaps. In all of this, John Searle played a clarifying, leading part. For a couple of years then, John and I shared something that happens to very few. We worked countless hours together on extraordinary issues with such intensity, intimacy, and mutual concern that I would weep to try to describe it here, and I probably will weep anyway. I treasure it and the 45-year deep family friendship that it began. Those accidents of personal history have made all the difference. I will say only that I learned there, this is where the emotion comes in the trenches, under terrible pressure, with everything we cared about at stake, with major societal consequences at stake, what a rare and magnificent man John Searle is. Brilliant, lucid, practical, principled, loyal, courageous, loving, and even vulnerable like the rest of us. We had first met in the fall of 1964 when I was already lucky to have Dagmar as my student in torts. And John was already prominently outspoken for free speech, which rightly seemed to him definitional in a university. Paul and Svetlana Alpers invited us to a dinner so that we could all meet each other. Excuse me. The first thing John said to me in that engaging growl, which you recognize, was, "Glad to meet you. Read that article of yours on causation. Reading your sentences is like picking up jagged rocks." I knew at once that we would become close friends. Actually, the only time I was ever troubled by this was when he told me he had made the same criticism of Michel Foucault. Was that a long time ago or just the other day? No one knows what to make of 50 years, and I won't try. But we should notice that John Searle has been first a prominent and then a dominant presence at Berkeley for more than 1/3 of its 141-year entire history. John has made the most of these 50 years, and the Searles have made the most of them. Their lives together have that same impossible comprehensiveness and quality that characterized John's career. Dagmar is a part of everything John has done. They have two remarkable sons, Thomas and Mark. Mark is here. They have traveled everywhere for John's lectures. They ski and more or less ran a winery. They've had dogs and cabins and oriental rugs. They know history and sociology and music and the politics of Berkeley real estate. They have many good friends. Just as John has stood for principles without moralizing, they have had a fullness of life without indulgence. The prophet is always there to assure restraint, duty, and work. The other day, I happened on something by a prominent law professor taking John to task for having a totalistic view of science, reducing everything to the particles of physics and leaving no room for humanity. This seems to me entirely to miss the point. Someone morally dedicated to persons who has created a career of such incredible fullness and lived a life of such zest and richness is unlikely to have a philosophy of rigid sterility. The point is that the real world is full enough and rich enough as it is, without self-deceived theorizing of one form or another. John's philosophical work that explains this is full and rich. And the reality it explains makes room for all that is full and rich in experience. What the prophet insists on is that we look at the real world head on, not as we would like it to be. The greatest poverty is not to live in a physical world, says Wallace Stevens, no stranger to humanity. Although he is more interested in the imagination than in the brain, and although John might not use the word metaphysical as Stevens does, I'd like to think that what Stevens goes on to say captures, in its way, John Searle's gift to us. So let me end with that. And out of what one sees and hears, and out of what one feels, who could have thought to make so many selves, so many sensuous worlds, as if the air, the midday air, was swarming with the metaphysical changes that occur merely in living as and where we live. Thank you.
Well, it really is a special, singular pleasure for me to return to this place where I learned so much, to pay tribute to my dissertation advisor. Although I doubt I'm going to be able to capture in words how important he's been for me. And I'm sure what I'm about to say will fail to express how grateful I am to him, but it will give me unique satisfaction to try. I arrived at Berkeley in 1995 with vague ideas about writing a dissertation in philosophy of mathematics or logic. And that lasted about 2 weeks into the first-year graduate student seminar that year, which was on philosophy of language, and which, to my great good fortune, was led by John Searle. Listening to Searle talk about Frege and Russell and the rest of 20th century philosophy of language remains the most exciting thing that has ever happened to me in the classroom. And it would not be too much of an exaggeration to say that everything I have done in philosophy since can be traced back in one way or another to what happened in that first year seminar. So I ended up writing a dissertation in philosophy of language, and of course, John Searle was my dissertation advisor. A guiding idea of my dissertation, which continues to be central for me, and which I owe entirely to John Searle, is the idea that the speech act is the fundamental unit of analysis in philosophy of language. Meaning, truth, reference, satisfaction, all of it arises out of what we do when we make assertions and ask questions and give orders. So explanations in philosophy of language should start with the speech act. That deeply Searlean idea is something that pervades everything that I work on. But Searle's importance for me has not just been theoretical. Professionally, he's been as good an advisor as one could hope for. I'm quite sure I wouldn't have the job I have now at the University of Minnesota if it weren't for his effort on my behalf. And I'll never forget the bottle of champagne he opened on the day I got the job offer. There's no doubt, though, that his greatest influence of all has been personal. One spring, he urged me to go to Seattle for an American Philosophical Association conference. One of his research assistants was going, and he wanted me to introduce her to people and show her around. That research assistant and I are now married, and we had our first child in September. So what I really wanted to talk about today are two of the most important lessons I learned from Searle. And I chose these particular lessons not just because they've been so valuable to me, but I think they reveal something about John Searle himself. The first lesson is the secret to writing clearly. John Searle is without a doubt one of the clearest writers ever to work in philosophy. His work sets a standard of clarity that we're all trying to live up to. Although, to be honest, it's probably a good thing that not every philosopher succeeds. Imagine if Aristotle or Kant or Wittgenstein wrote as clearly as Searle. We'd all be out of a job. Our students wouldn't need us anymore. His clarity is, of course, a source of his great philosophical power. One of the reasons Searle blows so many philosophers out of the water is that he's so much clearer than everyone else. It's impossible to hide from him. He has an incredible ability to cut through all the technical details and expose the philosophical essence of whatever position he's presently demolishing. Now, one of my favorite examples of this is Searle's response to formal decision theory. Now, here's Searle in his book, Rationality in Action, and I won't attempt an impersonation, so here's Searle. When I first learned about mathematical decision theory as an undergraduate at Oxford, it seemed to me there was an obvious problem with it. It seems to be a strict consequence of the axioms that if I value my life and I value 25 cents, there must be some odds at which I would bet my life against a quarter. I thought about it and I concluded there are no odds at which I would bet my life against a quarter. And if there were, I certainly wouldn't bet my son's life against a quarter. So over the years, I argued about this with several famous decision theorists. And usually, after about half an hour of discussion, they came to the conclusion, you are just plain irrational. Well, I am not so sure, Searle says. So that's almost enough to make one feel sorry for those famous decision theorists, almost. So what is the secret to writing clearly? Examples. This is something Searle used to say to me over and over again. Examples, he'd say. Examples, examples, examples. You need more examples. You're not being clear until you've given some examples. And he's absolutely right about this. Clear writing in philosophy, and really anything else, begins and ends with examples. As I'm sure you all know, John Searle is a master of the philosophical example. We owe to him one of the great examples of 20th century philosophy. I mean, of course, the Chinese room example. But my favorite example of Searle's examples is about something else. It comes in the context of an argument for something he calls the background. Now, here's the idea of the background, stated in the abstract and with full generality. The literal meaning of a sentence determines truth or satisfaction conditions only relative to a background of non-intentional abilities, assumptions, habits, and expectations. Now, that sounds pretty good, but it doesn't really mean anything until you look at some examples. Now, here's one of my favorites. Here's Searle again. Suppose I go into a restaurant determined to say exactly and literally what I mean. That is, determined to utter imperative sentences that give exact expression to my desires. I start by saying, give me a hamburger, medium rare, with ketchup and mustard, but easy on the relish. Now suppose, for example, that the hamburger is brought to me encased in a cubic yard of lucite plastic, so rigid that it takes a jackhammer to bust it open. Or suppose the hamburger is a mile wide and is delivered to me by smashing down the wall of the restaurant and sliding it in. Has my order been fulfilled in these cases? Well, obviously it hasn't been obeyed. So there must be unspoken assumptions or expectations about how hamburger orders are filled that combine with the literal meaning of the sentence to rule these cases out. And Searle's example makes that beautifully and powerfully clear. The importance of examples is a lesson I try to pass on to my students. I tell graduate students that a trick to finding the weakness in a philosophy paper is to find the place where the author fails to give an example. The trick can be applied profitably to oneself. I always know that I've come to a dead end whenever I can't think of a good example to illustrate some claim I've made. That's when I know I need to start over. And I think one of the reasons this works is that examples force you to be honest with yourself. A good example draws out intuitions that simply can't be ignored or papered over. And one of the things I'm really grateful for is that John Searle taught me how to be honest with myself when I'm doing philosophy. And he taught me this through his insistence on examples. So there's a lot there in this one lesson. Clarity, power, honesty, it's all there in the examples. Now, the second lesson is something that Searle used to say to me at the end of the audio tapes I would get from him with comments on chapters of my dissertation. I would give him a piece of writing, and a week or so later, he'd return it along with an audio tape of his comments. And it was a good system. He could say a lot more on the tape than what he could write down in the margins. Now, at the end of every tape, after dismantling whatever poorly conceived idea I'd come up with that week, he would always say the same thing. Now, Peter, the most important thing is keep going. Keep going. All right, that's it. Click. And then the tape would stop. Now, I've thought a lot about what he meant by those words, keep going. One thing he clearly meant was that I should continue to work hard. I'm not sure everyone realizes just how hard John Searle works. His output is just amazing. I can count 11 books since I met him. 10? 18. Well, since I met him in 1995. Yeah. 11 since 1995 when I met him. And those are just the books. And during the time I was here at Berkeley, he could always be counted on to be in his office, pacing the floor, writing, dictating, editing, proofreading, corresponding, talking to students and colleagues all over the world. That is, if he wasn't in the classroom giving a lecture or leading a seminar. But it's really no secret that you need to work hard to be successful in philosophy, just like anything else. So I think Searle meant much more than that when he told me to keep going. Philosophy is a creative endeavor. And like anything creative, most of the time your ideas don't go anywhere. If it were possible to count ideas, I'd say you'd be doing pretty well if you have one good idea out of every 100. And really good ideas Ideas that truly advance our understanding of some philosophical problem, you'd be lucky to have one or two of these over the course of a whole career. So there's a lot of failure in philosophy, a lot of missteps and rejection. And it's easy to get discouraged, especially if you're a graduate student who isn't sure whether you're cut out for a career in philosophy. The best way to survive, maybe the only way, is to put your head down and keep going. Shrug off the failures and try something else. And even when an idea does pan out, don't get complacent. Keep pushing on to new problems and ideas and arguments. I don't know whether sheer brilliance is a necessary condition for success in philosophy, but it's definitely not a sufficient condition. Perseverance, though, without that, you won't make it very far at all. But even this still doesn't quite capture everything in his message to me to keep going. Think about it. You can't keep going without the confidence that there's something out there worth saying, that there's a good idea waiting for you just around the corner. He goes in with total and unwavering confidence that this problem is something we can solve. This is something we can figure out and get to the bottom of. And that optimism comes through on every page, and even more so in person, and it's exhilarating. So that's the second lesson. Keep going. There are many, many more lessons I could talk about, and so many other intangible ways in which he's influenced me. I could go on all day. But instead, I'll just say thank you, Professor Searle. Thank you so much, and congratulations on 50 years at Berkeley.
John Searle has something to do with the fact that I was born in Berkeley, California. My parents studied speech act theory at Tel Aviv University in the early 70s, which also illustrates the point that Professor Stroud made about the international influence of Searle's work. This one? Oh, this is the real one. Okay. Searle was a major reason why they left Israel in 1975 to start graduate school at Berkeley. Searle became my father's dissertation advisor, and 10 years later, I was born. Searle's work was a central part of the intellectual life that my father, Maya Kronfeld, shared with me. That John Searle had by then become a household name was literally true in my household. One of Searle's favorite examples, the indirect speech act, "Can you pass the salt?" was mentioned just about as much as it was used around the dinner table. I later understood that one of the remarkable things about speech act theory is that the analysis does not interfere with the functioning of the phenomena that you're trying to explain, that you're trying to analyze. I'll pass you the salt even once I understand that your request is masquerading as a question about my abilities. Similarly, marriages are not being annulled because the parties involved suddenly realize that their union hangs on a performative utterance. Still, outside of a university setting, there's often a fear that an analytic explanation runs the risk of breaking the spell of what it's trying to explain. The magic dissipates once we understand how something actually works. And indeed, this does give magicians something to worry about. The success of the magic act depends in part on the unavailability of the explanation. There may even be a few other domains where the magician's theory of knowledge makes sense. For instance, as a jazz musician, I worry, perhaps irrationally, that excessive training in harmony might somehow undo the pleasure of hearing. Yet I think Searle shows beautifully that philosophy can live side by side with the ordinary and extraordinary states of affairs that it describes, rather than canceling out or neutralizing them. Last year, which was 3 years after my father died, Searle asked me to TA for Philosophy 133, his course on the philosophy of mind. Later that night, when I was sharing the good news with my mom, I discovered that this was the very same course that my father had TA'd for Searle when he was a graduate student in the late 70s and early 80s. Of all the things my father and I have in common, this is surely the most uncanny. It's tough to face the fact that my father and I would share this experience unbeknownst to him. I think Searle would call this sharing without mutual belief. 30 years separate my father's experience from mine, and clearly a lot's changed. But going through my father's collection of cassette tapes, I found several recorded lectures from Philosophy 133, September 1981. What strikes me when I listen to these recordings, besides the fact that I recognize a lot of the jokes, what strikes me is a profound, even an eerie sense of historical and intellectual continuity, a sense of an internally coherent worldview unfurling over time. Searle's work will always remain a point of contact between my dad and me. And by saying this, I mean to emphasize not only the extraordinary mark Searle has left on my family history, but also a certain feature of his work that makes such contact possible at all. Searle's later work on social reality, for example, is to such a great extent in dialogue with his earlier work in the philosophy of language that if I had the power to go back and meet my dad when he was my age, studying speech act theory at Tel Aviv University, he and I would be comparing notes on different aspects of a single philosophical system rather than a set of disparate explanations. I want to say something here about Searle's philosophical style and its influence on his students. Perhaps one of the most striking characteristics of Searle's work is what one book reviewer calls, quote, an extreme effort and capacity to express himself with clarity, end quote. We may not always agree with Searle, but we are rarely in doubt about what he means. When I was a TA last semester, I was amazed by the pace at which Searle's students seemed to internalize the commitment to verbal clarity that he was modeling for them on a daily basis. In fact, many of those students are here today. And Searle is self-conscious in this approach. He writes the following aside, for example, in his introduction to the book Intentionality, quote, "Where questions of style and exposition are concerned, I try to follow a simple maxim. If you can't say it clearly, you don't understand it yourself." End quote. Here, Searle, I think, actually reveals an interesting symmetry between style and philosophical content. What this maxim also suggests, once we massage it into contrapositive form, is that if you do understand it yourself, you are capable of saying it clearly. There's a non-trivial claim at work here about the adequacy of language for the communication of thought. And this maxim looks to me to be a very close relative of Searle's principle of expressibility, according to which whatever can be meant can be said. To take this one step further, it seems to me that Searle's manner of teaching and writing is not only consistent with his philosophical convictions, but also exemplifies what might even be termed an ethics of style. The idea is that we should make language work for us rather than against us, where the us in question is inclusive rather than exclusive. Whenever friends confronted me with doubts about the practical applications of my philosophy degree, I would tell them that I'm using philosophy to sharpen my bullshit detector. Now that I've graduated, I feel entitled to use technical terms, right? Searle's bullshit detector is top of the line, and
how about the dispenser?
He's got that too. And let me just list a few of the dangerous things from which a finely tuned BS detector can protect us. False premises, fallacies, hidden assumptions, tacit consent, equivocation, and most of all, texts in which obfuscation acts as an end in itself. As we know, most abhorrent of all to Searle is academic language whose style performs or acts out the impossibility of referring successfully. If there's one thing that Searle has hammered into his students, it's the distinction between the expression and the thing expressed. You might say that in Searle's work, style is important precisely because it gets out of the way. Now, as someone who's interested in literature and music, I certainly don't wish for style always to get out of the way. But when it comes to studying philosophy, there's a tremendous amount to be learned from Searle's way of foregrounding the ideas themselves. Most of us get around in the world by adopting different stylistic registers for different communicative purposes. Not so with Searle, it seems to me. Students who pick up a copy of one of John's books can expect to find there the very same voice that they heard in the lecture hall, in the seminar, in the lounge, or on the ski slopes if they ever found him there. Most academics simply don't write books about philosophy the same way they talk to their mechanic, or conversely, they don't talk to their mechanic the same way they write books about philosophy. But it seems to me that Searle simply has no trouble at all maintaining total personal and philosophical authenticity and continuity at all times. And one result is that his intended addressees, whether imagined or actual, are always multiple and various. By being simultaneously, and I think this simultaneity is important, one of the world's most readable philosophers, and one of the toughest intellectual critics around at the same time, Searle has redefined for his students what a life of the mind is really about. In a biographical portion of a 2001 interview, Searle gives us a taste of his views on his own education and, by extension, the education of others. Here's what he said, quote, "So I did get two things at Oxford. One, a sheer respect for the facts, and two, a certain amount of self-confidence that I could actually do this subject. And those are the things that I try to give my students, a sense that you can do this. It's something that's done by a lot of famous people, but you do it anyway. And secondly, when you do it, you better respect the facts." End quote. Note that on this view, it's the facts that act as authority figures, not the famous people. As he points out in Mind, Language, and Society, with an implicit nod to his old faithful notion, direction of fit, we are answerable to the facts. The facts are not answerable to us. Now, as a student of literature, I have to admit I didn't think I had much interest in the facts, per se. Maybe it's because I came to Cal in the wake of post-structuralism, for which the so-called limits of representation call into question any discursive practice that places the facts at its center. I was surprised, therefore, to find that Searle had very interesting things to say about the limits of representation precisely because of his commitment to realism. Searle summarizes his view on representation in an early article that explores the way representation works in the Velázquez painting Las Meninas. He writes, quote, "All forms of intentionality are under an aspect or aspects of the things represented. Nothing is ever represented tout court, but only under some aspect or other." End quote. I might add that for every aspect of an object that a representation sheds light on, there are many more aspects on which the representation remains silent. But some of those aspects left out of the foreground may even be irretrievably lost. But far from exposing a failure or shortcoming of visual representation, I think Searle's analysis illustrates instead that this limit of representation may actually be a condition of possibility for the artistic. It should come as no surprise, then, that for Searle, it is similarly not a lamentable limit of representation that each representation is attached to a point of view. For him, the perspectival nature of representation is not itself cause for an epistemic crisis. Rather, point of view is precisely the kind of apparatus designed to bring us into contact with things that aren't themselves points of view. Furthermore, as Searle observes, because it's an intrinsic feature of consciousness, point of view itself is also a remarkable fact about things as they are, to use Wallace Stevens' phrase. I don't know why, but of all the things I learned from Searle, this makes me the most cheerful. In closing, I would like to thank Professor Searle and Professor Wallace for inviting me to participate in the celebration here today. There's a lot of famous people in the room, but you do it anyway. Thank you.
Yes, everybody.
I need to know that the should be spoken. John and Dagmar, other luminaries, ladies and gentlemen, friends. I apologize for arriving late from a Cal 24 seminar for freshmen and sophomores, a commendable program of Christina Maslach in which we expose young students to contemporary topics not yet in the domain of the normal university curriculum. My own topic this year is order, disorder, chaos, and fractals, a subject, in my opinion, not unrelated to the center of our attention today, John Searle. In coming here and deciding what to say, I'm faced with two conundrums. The first is that I'm unsure whether we gathered here today among friends to bathe John in the abundant and fragrant waters of his intellect and accomplishments, or to roast him in the fiery fumes of his equally abundant humility. Put more simply, have we come here to bury John at 6 feet or to bury him at 12 feet? I feel obliged to try a little of each. Second, arriving late, I have no idea what my predecessors have said about John, except for the very last part of the previous speaker, former student. So it is not unlikely that I shall repeat much of it, but is this not inevitable? After all, there is only so much one can say about John Searle. I'm not going to talk about philosophy. I'm not going to talk about the work of John analytically. John and his books, his colleagues and his students, I think, have spoken about that sufficiently. I'd like to end what has probably been a rather formal and possibly at times heavy philosophical gathering on a lighter note. John, I'd like to say on behalf of your friends who have come here from all corners of the globe, some I can see as far away as El Cerrito, surely you can feel here palpably our adulation of you. I do note at least one geographical exception, the eminent philosopher Thomas Nagel, who I understand spoke first. Second. How did that happen? So one geographical exception. And I wondered whether what brought you here, Thomas, was the stick of the weather in New York, looking outside, probably not the case, or the local carrot. Thomas, do you have family here? You might ask why I, a mathematician, physicist, and mostly chemist, was asked to speak at a symposium honoring a philosopher, a thinker of the smartest, most elevated of intellectual enterprises. Well, no one put it better than John himself when he gave me, on some occasion, many years ago, what I'm sure he intended as a compliment. Alex, you can't be a chemist. You're too smart. John, allow me to return a compliment. It's difficult, if not impossible, to believe that you really have been teaching here at Cal for 100 years. John Searle is an extraordinary human being. Brilliant, knowledgeable, witty, cultured, articulate, possessing an endlessly youthful vitality and curiosity. He has a rare combination of scholarship and the ability to impart that scholarship through his writings and his teaching. His work is characterized for me by a beautiful analytical simplicity. It does not hide behind often impenetrable philosophical nomenclature or ideas, but proceeds in a transparent, compelling, and ultimately ends in a beautiful body of scientific philosophical thought in which he infers, amongst other thoughts, that the mind and brain are not one and the same, but that the mind and its associated consciousness derive, emerge from the specific underlying biological structure of the brain, fashioned with apparent genius by 1 billion years of evolution. The mind and consciousness are no more a large, complicated electronic computer than Shakespeare is the result of billions of monkeys sitting at billions of typewriters. In physics and chemistry, too, I believe that emergence is a key concept, that the notion that all can be explained from the bottom up, the TOE, the theory of everything, is absurd. Yes, properties of bulk material, of course, derive from the constituent components and the laws that govern their behavior, but there emerge in this transition from the lower to the higher levels new attributes, new qualities, new laws, with an independence and robust self-containment of their own. So wetness, viscosity, turbulence, and waves of water should hardly be explained by the quantum mechanical rules that govern the behavior of nuclei and electrons in water molecules or small ensembles thereof. In my 24 Chaos and Fractal seminar, I'm showing the students how simple deterministic rules with apparently well-defined initial conditions can lead nevertheless to evolution which is probabilistic. The probability is not imposed ex post facto, but emerges from the very theory. Generic properties are predicted, an example of which is a fractal, or what is called a strange attractor, that underlies chaotic motion. Indeed, this could be the case for motion of particles, sports. You start in the same initial condition, but you'll never have the same soccer game twice. Human beings, protein folding, the mind, and conscious thought. But the details of where we are in the space of those properties is not predictable. A sort of physical free will. On this, John and I have spoken and argued on many occasions, and I'm continually astounded by the penetrating depth of his questions regarding physical principles such as determinism versus uncertainty, and their relationship to his own original and beautiful work as exemplified by his Chinese room. Yes, it behaves as if it speaks Chinese, but does it really understand? In physics, yes, it behaves like a steam engine, but is it really a steam engine? Even in physics, we are in the very early alchemical phlogiston era of understanding. Surely that is the case for the brain-mind problem. We have so little information, and we try to infer so much, like the proverbial blind man and the elephant. More pieces of the jigsaw puzzle now being provided partly by functional MRI observations of cognitive processes in the brain are at least a start in this direction. But even now, there are those scientists who declare categorically that consciousness is a consequence of superconductivity in the brain, or the result of microtubules interacting via quantum entanglement. Surely they are at best premature. We know too little and infer, declare too much. John Searle is an exception. Apropos inferring too much from too little, I'm reminded of the wonderful story of old Sadie Greenberg, who comes back from the grocery store to her apartment. Can I ask the bottle? The big one. Comes back with her groceries. She schleps up 4 flights of stairs, goes into her apartment, puts the groceries on the bed. The telephone rings. She picks up the telephone. She says, "Hello?" And she hears, "I know what you want. You want me to come over to your house and break down the door and come in and throw you on the bed and tear off your clothes." And she says, "Wait a minute. All this you know from hello?" So yes, we tend to infer too much from too little. So back to the Searle-Pines overlap, beyond our friendship and enjoyable screaming arguments, I would say there are roughly 4 areas of overlap between John's thoughts and my own. Firstly, emergence and new attributes and laws. Could they be related, for the philosopher and this student of the mind, to the qualia and consciousness that John describes so lucidly? Secondly, we need more data, more observations. We need to see more of the jigsaw puzzle. We can't put the whole thing down at once. This problem of mind consciousness will take at least 100. 100 what, you ask? It's like the patient who visits the doctor, says, "So doc, how is it?" He says, "I'm sorry, Moish, but it's very bad news." He says, "Very bad? I mean, how bad? How much time do I have?" The doctor says 10. He says 10? 10 what? I mean, 10 years, 10 months, 10 weeks? The doctor says 9. So my 100 I will leave with units undefined. The notion that deterministic rules lead to deterministic behavior can't be right. You can have generic features consistent with probability, uncertainty, and a kind of free will, even in physical systems. That's the third thing we agree on, I think. Many descriptions of nature, the fourth thing, are constructs of the mind. For example, possibly time. Time as a continuous flowing variable going from past to future is taken for granted, certainly by scientists like myself, I think by everyone. They pervade all our physical theories of particle interactions and motion through differential equations in which we simply put down t or dt. But there are other ways of perceiving nature as discrete sequences, iterative, ordered, and locally causal, but with no specific continuous time. There's a very interesting discussion between Jean Piaget and Albert Einstein on the issue of time. You can see why they were both interested in time. Einstein because of relativity, and Piaget because of the development of the perception of the world by children. When and how do children perceive space and time? Einstein was interested in the question of when it is that children develop this notion of time, something flowing, of past and future. And Piaget answered that this happens around age 6 or 7. I think many of the audience here know more about this than I do. I think that now it's considered to be slightly later than that, but that's in the ballpark of when they develop these notions of space and time. Apropos this whole notion, as an anecdote, my number 4 son, Jonathan, whom John and Dagmar and many others here know very well, mathematical prodigy, must have been about age 3 or 4. My wife, Dietza, who's sitting in the back, there's a psychologist, was showing him an album of himself as an infant. How he was born, how I held him, how I gave him his first shot of whiskey, his diapers, growing up, crawling, standing up, starting to walk. He saw the whole thing. He loved it. He said, "Mom, that's wonderful. Can I now see pictures of me when I'm grown up?" He had not yet developed this notion of past and future, and I'm not sure that time as a continuous variable in a finite universe is necessarily the right concept. I hope that's something. It's probably the most contentious of the 4 things that I think we agree about, John. And I look forward to arguing with you about it over some appropriate beverage. Not this one. John has written many extraordinary books. As a stimulating colleague and dear friend, he himself is like a good book, or perhaps a very tenacious, albeit valuable and beneficial virus. Like such a good book, once you pick him up, it is impossible to put him back down again. That reminds me of the book by Joan Collins, the actress who decided to write a book and had the presence of mind to hire Swifty Lazar as her agent. And basically, his contract read something like, any 200 pages of crap she puts on the editor's desk gets her $1.5 million, which she proceeded to do. She sued because she wasn't given the 1.5 million, and she prevailed. And ultimately, the book was published after lots of editing. The review said, once you put this book down, you will find it impossible to pick up again. I recommend that you read John Searle in the original. I haven't read all his books. Many of those that you mentioned on perception of elements, I have those on language, those of the mind-body problem, mind-brain problem, the whole notion of consciousness, qualia. Those are the ones that interest me because they involve emergence and new levels of physical and biological phenomena. But I have read the originals. There's a story about a French socialite who once approached the notoriously taciturn James Thurber. "Oh, Mr. Thurber, I love your books. In fact, I read the last one in the French translation, which of course is superior." "Yes," replied Thurber drolly, "it does tend to lose something in the original." And regarding books, John can dish it out, but he can also take it. I recall an occasion on which he was describing translations of his many books into other languages. His book on the mind-brain problem had just been translated into its, I don't know, was it its 14th? Ballpark 14th language, German. I inquired, "John, was it entitled Mein Kopf?" He chuckled and gave me that infamous look of, "Pines, you're too smart by half," with a teensy admixture of, "They should have done a better job of getting rid of you guys." I was asked to be witty or brief, so I'll stop after being brief with a small anecdote about when to end a brief address of this type. This is apropos of the great speaker and thinker, extraordinarily articulate writer Abba Eban. Zalman Shazar, at that time president of Israel, was giving an address. It was an evening address. People had had dinner. They were tired. There had been speeches before that. And Shazar was going on and on. The chairman of the session was not Wallace, but it was Abba Eban. And Shazar turned to Eban, made the mistake of saying, "Abba, how much time do I have left?" To which Eban replied, "Zalman, you don't need a clock. What you need is a calendar." Dagmar. So brilliant, beautiful, charming, cultured, an accomplished lawyer. It is said that behind every successful man there is an astonished mother-in-law. But in this case, it's the not-so-astonished and accomplished wife. John has Dagmar Searle. From Czechoslovakia, a country subjected to invasion, oppression, torture, the challenging trajectory of her escape in her early life. But all that pales in comparison to her decades of life with John Searle. John, you're a precious jewel of Cal. It is said in the Talmud, in the Ta'anit actually, "Harbe lamadti mimorai, ומחבריי יותר מרבותיי, ומתלמידיי יותר מכולם." I guess you're expecting a translation. "Much have I learned from my teachers, more from my comrades, but most have I learned from my pupils." John, you're one of the few whom I regard as all three, teacher, comrade, and pupil. For this privilege and for your friendship, I am eternally grateful. Dagmar and John, to many, many more years of learning, teaching, laughter, friendship, and love. Thank you.
Well, I was abashed before I heard these speeches because it's very hard to regard longevity as a type of achievement. Living in Berkeley is like living in paradise. I don't get any credit for that. And I find that the calendar manages to turn over by itself. However, though I was abashed, I'm actually quite stunned by the quality and the moving eloquence of the talks you have heard. And I constantly had the feeling they must be talking about some other guy. But in any case, let me, by way of thanking the speakers, say a little bit about each of them. They were not properly introduced because it's not really about them, so let me tell you a little bit about what they've meant to me. Barry Stroud has been here almost as long as I have. And in the early days, we used to go down to the office together and try to invent a philosophy department. And then, as Barry said, we would spend a lot of evenings in each other's houses lamenting what a hard time we had with the elders that ran the department. And I wonder if our current junior members regard us with an equally productive hostility. In a way, I hope so, because it turned out that wonderful things resulted from that. Tom Nagel is a very important figure in my life in ways that he doesn't probably understand. I remember all those early days that he talks about, knowing him in Oxford and then in Berkeley. But Tom has a remarkable quality for a philosopher, and that is he knows how to make the moves of contemporary analytic philosophy. He is a superb practitioner, but at the same time, he has the depth and the range of far more traditional philosophers. He is a model to all of us of how to do very high-level professional work, at the same time with a much greater range than mainstream analytic philosophy. I can't tell you what Bob Cole means to me, and I'm afraid I'll burst into tears if I try, but I'll say a little bit about it. We had the FSM, and it was much celebrated, and I'm not sorry that we did it. As somebody once said, Goethe, in fact, the most you can hope for in life is that you don't regret the extreme behavior of your youth, but you don't want to repeat it either. I enjoyed the FSM, but I don't want to do it over again. When we got to the aftermath of the FSM, that was much tougher. And going into the university administration with Bob and myself and Bud Scheidt and Roger Hines, we had to sort of reinvent a university and maintain it on a daily basis under extremely trying circumstances. There's something comforting about being hated by both the right and the left. You think, if all of these bastards hate me, I must be doing something right. But it was stressful, I must admit, and Bob and I and the other two lived through it together, and Bob and I became forever close in those days. I won't try again to say what a superb student Peter Hanks was, but you can see from the quality of his presentation that he has an absolutely first-rate philosophical intellect. He combines dedication with clarity and profundity. I have to tell you a minor joke about clarity. I had a friend who was a visiting professor here who was not famous for clarity, named Michel Foucault. And one day I said to him, "How come you write so badly?" We were speaking in French. Pourquoi tu écris si mal? His English was really terrible. And he said to me in French, he said, look, if I wrote the way you do, as clearly as you do, nobody in Paris would take it seriously. They would think it was childish to try to write so clearly. And I said, oh, come on, you're pulling my leg. And he said, no, in France, you have to have at least 10% that's totally incomprehensible. Au moins 10% incompréhensible. And I thought, well, maybe it's just a joke. So when I was giving a series of lectures at the Collège de France, I tried this out on my host, Pierre Bourdieu, not a guy famous for clarity either. And Pierre said, no, it's much worse than 10%, more like 20%. Anyway, Peter is a model of clarity. Now, I have to say a couple of words about Maya. It's a wonderful thing in Berkeley to have such brilliant undergraduate students, but Maya is a genius in 3 different disciplines. That's not bad. How she does it, I don't know, but she's absolutely first-rate as a philosopher. She does comparative literature, and if you really are lucky, you'll get to hear her play her jazz music. She is a superb jazz musician and the head of a well-known jazz trio. And now we come to Alex. In a way, one of the chief merits of this whole gathering, I think, is I want the philosophical world to see Alex Pines in the flesh. I won't try to describe but you can see that he is a superb intellect and an enormously forceful personality. Anyway, I'm immensely grateful to all of these wonderful people for the kind words they've said about me. Now, let me say a few words about how I got here. Before I do that, though, I want to say something special. 50 years, I could not have done it without Dagmar. I cannot tell you how much my family has meant to me. And Dagmar and my two sons, Mark is here. Thomas is a lieutenant colonel in the Special Forces, and he telephoned me from Afghanistan this morning. This is a continuing discussion that we have. He actually wants to be in Afghanistan now that Iraq has become uninteresting. But that's the only reason he's not here today. In any case, I have to thank my family because they are and especially Dagmar, because they make it. They create the environment in which the 50 years actually occurred. Okay, now let me say a little bit about how I got here. Don't worry, I'm not going to summarize 50 years, but there are a couple of odd accidental features of how I got to Berkeley in the first place. The summer when I was 18 years old, I got a job working on a ship that took me across the Atlantic, and I hitchhiked around Europe, and I thought, this is the place for me. I did not really want to go back forever to Madison, Wisconsin. I had to go back for my junior year. And I wanted to apply for something that would take me back to Europe, and I discovered I wasn't eligible. You had to be a senior and all that sort of nonsense to apply for a Fulbright. There was one scholarship I was eligible to apply for, and that was the Rhodes Scholarship. I was just turned 19, and that was the minimal age, and you didn't have to have a degree, fortunately. This is why I never got a degree. And people told me, well, you won't get it, but try for it anyway. It might help you in subsequent years. Well, fortunately, I got it. I was excited that I got it, though I had hoped to go to Paris for all the wrong reasons. I didn't want to go for the intellectual life, but for the other amenities that were then available. And France in general, and Paris in particular, had a peculiar role to play in the imagination of young Americans of that era. I was soon disabused of my illusions that I had about the hedonism of the French middle class. But in any case, I didn't get to Paris, but I did get to Oxford, and it changed my life. I've often read how I went to Oxford to study with Austin and Strawson. I never heard of them. I arrived there just after my 20th birthday, and I never heard of these people who loomed so largely in my life. And then after I got my degree, I stayed on in Oxford. And you could do that. In those days, you didn't have to have a PhD in order to get a regular job. I started out as a research lecturer and then became a lecturer at Christ Church. And then I thought, I really have to go back to the United States. And then I met Dagmar. We got married, and we really did want to go back to the United States. Now, my friends in Oxford thought, that's ridiculous. You're a fixture around here. You've been here 7 years. You're not going to go back to Oxford. They would say, with whom would you possibly speak over there? They have so many states over there. And they just did not believe that I would say, I got to get off this goddamn island. And they thought that this was, oh, Christopher, come, John's going on again about it all. But nobody really took it seriously that I would ever leave for California. The question was where to go. I had an offer from Berkeley and another one from an Ivy League university that at that point had a much better philosophy department than Berkeley did. And Dagmar and I sat down in this absurd decision theoretic way and made a list of all the pros and cons of these two universities. I knew in my heart we were going to go to California. And Austin urged me to go to California. He was very anxious for the wrong reasons. He thought I was going to go to California and spread the word that I was going to take Oxford philosophy to the heathen. But he was also, he wrote me a letter just before we left, and it's a kind of letter that a Roman empire would send to a proconsul sent out to govern Spain or something like that. The letter said, when in Berkeley, I shouldn't speak too highly of Oxford philosophy if I were you. Be diplomatic! Exclamation point. Well, diplomacy was never my strong point. So in any case, I'm sure I disappointed him in that way. In any case, that's how I wound up in Berkeley, and I've never regretted it for a moment. It has been a superb experience for me, and since its virtues are very well known, let me mention a couple that are not so well known. One of the things that convinced me that I should come to Berkeley was I had a conversation with a physicist in Oxford who had won the Nobel Prize. And this, remember, was at a time when American universities were not highly regarded in Europe, and certainly not in Oxford. And in Oxford, everybody thought, and I thought, this is the world's best university. And we erroneously thought that probably aren't very many good universities in America. But this physicist told me he thought Berkeley was the best university in the world. And that made a deep impression on me. What's so great about it? Well, there are a number of things. When I first got here, I heard, of the faculty research lectures I heard, one of the early ones was by Alfred Tarski. Now, there are, in no era are there many guys like Alfred. Alfred wrote 200 papers, and mathematicians tell me that any 10 of them would have made you a world-class figure. Any 10 of them would have made you famous. But I thought of Alfred as a kind of archetypal Berkeley figure. But the special thing about Berkeley that is not widely known, and that is the superb quality of the upper division undergraduates. They are a joy to teach. Now, what's so special about them? I think the students that I've had in other universities probably have comparable IQs, but Berkeley students have a very special quality, and I discovered this really when I was teaching in other universities. I travel a lot, and I'm a visiting professor in lots of universities, and especially in Europe, I discovered I was trying to make my German students into Berkeley students. And in the end, they did get to be Berkeley students. Now, what did I have to teach them? Berkeley students have what you might call respectful, skeptical enthusiasm. The emphasis on the skeptical. They're very skeptical. They want to know, really, how do you know all this stuff you're trying to tell us, and why are you trying to tell us, and is it really worth telling, and is it really true? But at the same time, they're not hostile or rude, but they're very enthusiastic. They're enthusiastic about the subject, they're enthusiastic about the questions that are being asked, and they're even enthusiastic about the course they're taking. Now, what I discovered, for example, with German students love philosophy. They turn out in the hundreds and the thousands. Why doesn't Germany produce more great philosophers? Well, part of the answer is that every society has to have a method for crushing the young. You must find some way to crush the young. In America, it's called a PhD degree. But in Germany, it's called, what's the name of it? I can't remember German words. The thing you do after you get your PhD. Yeah, the Habilitationsschrift. Yeah, the young crusher in Germany is the Habilitationsschrift. But in any case, my German students were not in the practice of raising their hands in class and challenging the views of the Herr Professor Doktor. That's just not the style at which German education is conducted. And that's what I taught them to do. And in the end, they became Berkeley students. They're intelligent. Their English, by the way, is much better than my French students or my Italian students, though no better than my students in Scandinavia. But in the end, you can make students around the world to behave like Berkeley students. They are skeptical, they want to engage you in conversation, and they're enthusiastic. However, there's one great virtue about Berkeley. I don't have to make Berkeley students into Berkeley students. They already are Berkeley students, and that's one of the reasons I love being here. Thank you.
I think we should let John have the last word.
The last word.